You're already bankrupt, Gary.
Money is a wall. And for 42 years, Gary Cloud had built his $10 billion wall higher than any skyscraper. It kept his enemies out and his fortune safe. Or so he thought. That morning, as he walked down the marble steps of the Royal Tower, the wall felt like sand. He'd just finished a heated meeting where he learned millions were hemorrhaging from his offshore accounts. Before we dive deep into the story, don't forget to like, share, and hit the subscribe button. Your support goes a long way to help us. He slammed the car door of his sleek black luxury sedan, the sound echoing the private curse of a man who controlled everything, but was losing to an invisible thief. A few feet away, a homeless man in a tattered coat was asking for spare change, his own walls long since burned down. The contrast was a slap in the face. Gary's fury at the invisible betrayal morphed into a cruel, mocking amusement directed at the visible misery. He spotted the weathered cardboard sign. Need change? I can give you advice, too. With a cold smile, Gary waved his men back and approached. He didn't walk toward the beggar for wisdom. He walked toward him to deliver a spectacular taunt. He walked over to remind himself that he was Gary Cloud and everyone else was dirt. His voice was laced with condescension, a sneer barely hidden. "All right, old man," he challenged, his shadow falling over the beggar. "You say you give advice?" Gary pulled a thick wad of cash from his inner pocket, not for charity, but for sport. "Tell me this," he demanded. "How do you invest when you have 10 billion and nothing left to lose?" The question was a sneer. The beggar looked up slowly. His face was weathered, but his gray eyes were impossibly calm, too knowing. "Depends," the man said, his voice quiet but steady. "Are you investing for money or for peace?" Gary laughed, finding the question absurd. "What kind of dumb question is that? Money is peace." The laughter died in his throat as the beggar simply nodded. "Then you're already bankrupt." Gary froze. The world seemed to stop moving around the black sedan and the marble steps. For the first time in his powerful life, someone had thrown words at him that didn't shrink before his authority. The confidence of the man who'd already lost everything stood in stark contrast to Gary's current fear. He stood there, staring down, his $10 billion world suddenly seeming very small. The laughter had died. An unnerving, dangerous curiosity had taken hold in his mind. If you were Gary, would you have him arrested for the disrespect, or would you be intrigued? Comment below with your reaction. Don't miss what happens next. This conversation is the key to Gary's entire empire. Like and subscribe to join the journey. The joke had backfired. The man who called himself Jeremy Haine had just turned Gary's internal crisis into an external confrontation. Gary dismissed his men with a curt wave and stepped closer, ready to see if this beggar was a prophet, a fool, or something far more dangerous. That answer, "Then you're already bankrupt," had done what no federal indictment or rival gang could do. It silenced Gary Cloud. Gary stared, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The beggar returned the look, his steady gray eyes seemingly measuring the empty space behind Gary's $10 billion facade. Unsettled yet fiercely intrigued, Gary finally recovered. He turned, signaling his driver with a dismissive jerk of his head. "Wait in the car, all of you, now!" His men, who had never seen the boss halt an entire morning to speak to a vagrant, exchanged confused, tense glances before retreating to the black sedan. Gary faced the man again, squatting slightly to meet him on his own level. "You think you're wise, old man?" he challenged, the mockery replaced by a razor-sharp curiosity. "Tell me your name." "Jeremy Haine," the beggar replied, not offering a hand, merely adjusting his knit cap. "All right, Jeremy," Gary continued, dropping the street taunt. "Explain the bankruptcy. I have vaults full of cash, controlling interest in half this city, and enough gold to melt down and pave this street. How am I bankrupt?" Jeremy didn't look at the royal tower or the luxury car. He looked at Gary's eyes. "You built your wealth on greed," Jeremy said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a judge. "Greed is debt. It demands you keep taking, keep fighting, keep looking over your shoulder. You have $10 billion, but you pay $1 billion a day in paranoia." Jeremy paused, then offered a cryptic parable. "A king built his fortress so tall no arrow could breach it. But who was the first to fall? The prince who shared his bed. The higher your walls, the closer your enemies hide." The words struck Gary hard. They echoed the meeting he'd just left, the secret holes in his finances, the suspicion that had fallen on his most trusted lieutenant, the paranoia that had been eating at him for months. Gary remembered his own climb, the ruthless takeover of rivals in the construction game, the brutal way he'd squeezed out his competitors, the cold decisions that left his family estranged. He'd told himself it was necessary, that power demanded solitude. Now, a man clutching a tin cup was telling him his solitude was a slow poison. Do you think Jeremy is speaking the truth, or is he just a clever hustler? What is the price of power? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you're captivated by this unusual duo, show some support for the channel by hitting like and subscribe. Gary felt his armor cracking. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick wad of cash, at least $1,000. He tossed it into Jeremy's cup. "That's for the sermon," he muttered, trying to regain control by reverting to mockery. "Go buy yourself a new suit." Jeremy didn't flinch. He carefully picked the money out of the cup and handed it back to Gary. "I don't sell advice for money," Jeremy stated, his gaze unwavering. "I don't sell ego." Gary froze, his mouth slightly open. No one refused his money. He stared at the cash in his hand, feeling an unfamiliar sting of disbelief and rejection. He jammed the money back into his pocket, climbed into his black sedan, and slammed the door. As the car pulled away, Gary looked in the rearview mirror. Jeremy Haine was still sitting by the steps, calm, watching the traffic, as if the last 5 minutes had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Gary Cloud drove off, but he couldn't shake the beggar's calm, knowing stare. The man had refused his money, insulted his life, and somehow left the wealthiest criminal in the city unsettled. And Gary knew, with chilling certainty, he had to see Jeremy Haine again. The last time Gary Cloud had trouble sleeping, he was 19 and fighting for control of his first illegal construction site. That was 2 decades and $10 billion ago. But that night, the comfortable weight of his silk sheets felt like a shroud, and the silence of his penthouse was heavy with a single, echoing phrase. "Then you're already bankrupt." Gary couldn't shake the beggar's calm, knowing stare. He kept replaying the scene. The casual confidence, the refusal of the money, the stinging truth in the parables about greedy kings and close enemies. Jeremy Haine, a name that seemed too quiet, too simple for the seismic shift he'd caused. He finally rose, moving through the cavernous apartment. He was a man accustomed to having answers before he even asked the questions, but now he only had riddles. Was Jeremy a former rival, an undercover agent, or just a truly wise fool? At 3:00 a.m., the digital chime of his secure line cut through the silence. It was his chief accountant, his voice thin with panic. "Boss, it's worse. The automated transfer just hit. Another $2 million is gone. It's the same pattern, boss. The money's bleeding out of the holding company in Dublin, and we can't trace the shell receiving it." Gary's fingers tightened around the phone. His composure, carefully maintained since his encounter with Jeremy, snapped. "Find it. You have the entire firm. I want to know who is stealing from me and how," he roared, the sound swallowed by the thick, soundproof glass. The irony was venomous. A man who controlled every illegal trade in the city was losing a war to invisible numbers on a screen. Jeremy's words about the prince who shared his bed twisted in his gut. Betrayal. It wasn't just possible. It was inevitable. The accounts that were bleeding were known only to a tight circle of his most trusted lieutenants. Paranoia, which Jeremy had called his billion-dollar daily debt, now hit Gary full force. Was it Leo Marcano, his right hand? Leo knew the codes, the companies, the whole setup. He'd been with Gary since the beginning. Or maybe Vinny, the lawyer who handled the overseas paperwork. Every ally suddenly felt like a hidden thief, every smile a potential knife. Who do you think is the real traitor in Gary's inner circle? Leo or Vinny? Or maybe someone else entirely? Share your predictions in the comments. And if you're enjoying the paranoia of this twisty story, hit the like button and subscribe to track down the thief. He slammed the phone down and barked orders to the two security chiefs already monitoring the lines. Find the beggar, the man named Jeremy Haine. I don't care what you have to do. Get me his last known location, his identification, anything. I want him on my desk by noon. By mid-morning, his chiefs returned, looking defeated. Jeremy Haine had vanished. No records, no known address, no ID, not even a security camera capture near the tower that wasn't too blurry to use. It was as if the man had dissolved into the cold morning mist. Gary was left pacing, his fury a coiled spring. That was when he saw it, resting neatly in the center of his massive mahogany desk. Right next to the antique silver letter opener was a small, plain brown envelope. No return address. No stamp. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Gary stopped pacing, his blood running cold. He stared at the envelope. Someone had breached his penthouse security, bypassing armed guards, biometric scanners, and hardened steel doors to leave him a simple piece of mail. The sight of the brown envelope paralyzed Gary Cloud. It wasn't the threat of violence that chilled him. It was the impossible breach of his solitude. Someone had slipped past a fortress of security to place a simple piece of paper on his desk, and that realization was more terrifying than a bullet. Gary snatched the envelope, his fingers tearing the cheap seal. He pulled out 2 sheets of paper. The first was a printout, a concise list of encrypted codes and transaction records from his secret Dublin holding company. At first glance, it looked like gibberish, but Gary's mind, built on decades of illicit finance, instantly recognized the structure. They were the exact holes where the $2 million had vanished this morning and the predicted dates for the next 3 drainages. The level of detail was surgical, terrifyingly precise. The second sheet was a scrap of recycled paper containing a single handwritten line. The script was clean, deliberate, and undeniably the final cut in Gary's unraveling control. Sometimes the one begging for change knows where the missing millions go. Gary's shock vanished, replaced by a scalding fury so intense it made him physically lightheaded. He roared, slamming the papers onto the desk. This wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. Someone was not only stealing from him, but was mocking him with irrefutable proof, delivered with supernatural stealth. He immediately called his two top financial analysts, not the official firm, but the private contractors who answered only to him. Over the next hour, fueled by pure adrenaline, Gary ran the cryptic data through his own internal systems. The verdict was immediate and damning. Everything was accurate. The envelope contained the complete roadmap of the theft, proving it was an inside job that had been in motion for months. The realization settled over him like a stone. This wasn't an external attack. This was betrayal by a ghost who lived in his numbers. Only a handful of people knew these accounts existed. As Gary scrolled through the list of authorized access, his paranoia focused like a laser beam. The data pointed not just to internal access, but to the system's creator. Suspicion crystallized around Leo Marcano. Leo wasn't just his lieutenant. He was his brother in crime, the man who'd stood by him during his rise, who'd set up these very shell companies. The thought of Leo selling him out was a sickening, visceral pain. Gary looked up, his face a mask of cold resolve. "Get surveillance on Marcano," he snarled into a secure phone. "Every meeting, every phone call, every bank transaction. I want his life on my desk by sunset." The proof is in Gary's hands. Do you think he's right to suspect Leo, or is the sender trying to frame his most loyal man? Who do you trust in this situation? Let me know in the comments. If you're hooked by this mystery, hit like and subscribe. The confrontation is coming. As the phone clicked off, Gary picked up the handwritten note again. He stared at the neat, quiet script. Could Jeremy Haine, the man who vanished into thin air, the man who refused his money, really be responsible for this? And if so, why was he giving Gary the tools to save his own empire? The question haunted him, a cold whisper in the silence. What did the beggar want? The silence in Gary's office was broken only by the methodical turning of pages. The surveillance report on Leo Marcano was comprehensive, sickeningly detailed, and utterly damning. Gary's men had worked fast, fueled by the boss's cold fury and the irrefutable data from the brown envelope. The evidence was laid bare. Leo Marcano, Gary's trusted lieutenant, was running a double life. He had created an elaborate network of secret shell companies, mirror images of Gary's own accounts, and used them to systematically drain the Dublin fund. The scheme was brilliant, hidden, and only exposed because the exact sequence of the theft had been handed to Gary by a ghost. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Leo wasn't just an employee. He was a ghost from Gary's past, a brother in crime. Gary flashed back. He remembered the smell of burnt plastic and cold rain. He was 25, bloodied, pinned in a warehouse by a rival crew. Leo had arrived, not with backup, but alone, a shotgun in his hands and a reckless snarl on his face. He didn't ask questions. He just started firing. They escaped together, licking their wounds in a stolen car. Later, they sealed their partnership not with a contract, but with a shared blood oath, a promise of loyalty until death. Leo had helped Gary rise from the gutters to the tower, always standing guard. That oath now felt like ash in Gary's mouth. He called Leo to his private office, a soundproof chamber where deals were sealed and enemies were silenced. Leo arrived, still confident, radiating the loyalty Gary had relied on for 2 decades. Gary didn't waste time. He simply slid the surveillance report and the printout from the brown envelope across the marble desk. Leo's composure shattered in an instant. His eyes darted from the documents to Gary's face, fear and a sudden reckless hatred warring in his expression. "You bastard!" Leo hissed, grabbing the papers. "Who told you? How could you know?" "I know everything, Leo," Gary said, his voice dangerously low. "I know you were eating me from the inside." Leo, realizing the game was over, dropped the pretense of loyalty and unleashed his bitterness. He threw the papers onto the floor. "You built an empire of greed, Gary. Did you think it wouldn't eat itself?" He laughed, a raw, broken sound. "I earned that money. I was there when you started, when you were nothing. You got the glory, the tower, and I got the spreadsheets. You were always so proud of your walls, Gary. Now look, I breached them without firing a shot." Gary didn't move. He had the right, the duty, and the means to end Leo's life right there. But a cold emptiness settled in his gut. There was no pleasure in this victory. Instead, Gary delivered the ultimate punishment: exile. "You're finished, Leo. Leave the city. Don't let me hear your name again. If you ever show your face, the theft of a few million will be the least of your problems." Leo Marcano left, broken and humiliated, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his brotherhood. Gary stood alone in the center of the office. He had eliminated the thief, saved his money, and exerted his power. Yet he felt no victory, only emptiness. He ran a hand over his face, remembering the beggar's words from the morning. "Power without principle is poison." The poison had nearly consumed him, and it had destroyed his closest friend. Gary spared Leo's life. Was this a sign of weakness, or a sign of the change Jeremy Haine promised? Do you think Gary made the right choice? Let me know your thoughts, and if you're ready for Gary's final confrontation with Jeremy, like and subscribe. I need to see Jeremy. It took Gary 2 agonizing days, 24 private investigators, and a near-illegal sweep of the city's abandoned infrastructure, but they finally found him. Not with codes or satellites, but with a basic tip from a dock worker. A quiet, bearded man who kept to himself under the old trestle bridge near the river docks. Gary drove himself this time. He left the black sedan a block away and walked alone beneath the massive, rusting steel of the bridge. The air was cold and damp, smelling of river mud and soot. In a small, sheltered space by a concrete pier, a figure sat warming his hands over a fire barrel, eating slowly from a tin can. Jeremy Haine. The beggar looked up as Gary's polished shoes crunched on the gravel. He showed no surprise, only a slight nod of recognition. It was their second meeting, and there was no mockery in Gary's eyes, only a heavy, complicated need. Gary approached the barrel, feeling the cheap heat on his face. The atmosphere was slower, heavier than their street encounter. The urgency of a financial leak had been replaced by the weight of a shattered belief. "The information was accurate," Gary stated, his voice stripped bare. "The man you warned me about, Leo Marcano, was stealing millions. I exiled him." Jeremy merely stirred the contents of the tin can with a fork. "The numbers were always there, Gary. You just weren't looking at the right source." Gary's fury was gone, replaced by a consuming curiosity. "You're not just some beggar," he said, stating the obvious. The data you sent was too clean, too specific. You knew the system. Jeremy finally looked up, his gaze steady in the flickering firelight. Once I was richer than you, he confessed quietly. I built companies, gave loans. I trained the wolves who called themselves partners. Gary crouched closer. What happened? Jeremy smiled faintly, a ghost of a successful man. I trusted them. They learned the system I built, then they cleaned me out. When I tried to fight back, they made sure I disappeared, on paper and in life. I became a ghost in the system I created. The confession hit Gary with sickening familiarity. Jeremy's story was the future Leo had tried to give him. So why help me? Gary asked. Why expose him? Why risk yourself? Jeremy's gaze was sharp, penetrating the lingering arrogance in Gary's suit. Because you're walking the same road I did. I thought power made me untouchable. Then I realized power without principle is poison. You've still got time to choose who you'll be when the money runs out. The words settled deep into Gary's soul. He took a long, shaky breath and pulled the gold signet ring from his finger, the heavy, expensive mark of his rule. He dropped it into Jeremy's battered tin cup. Then teach me, Gary said quietly, his voice a raw plea, before I lose it all. Gary has surrendered his pride to a homeless man. What is the first lesson Jeremy should teach him to truly change his empire? Tell us your idea in the comments. Jeremy Haine looked at the ring, then at Gary. He didn't pick it up. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips, the smile of a man who'd seen redemption before. The lesson had begun. The mentorship of Jeremy Haine began in stark contrast to the opulence of Gary Cloud's life. Their secret tutoring sessions alternated wildly, creating a jarring, unforgettable curriculum for the Mafia boss. One day, they would be on the rooftop of a financial tower, the city skyline spread out below them, talking about corporate structures. The next, they were huddled in a filthy alley, the sound of sirens providing the soundtrack to lessons on human nature and survival. Jeremy taught not with spreadsheets, but with parables. He spoke of clean wealth, how to rebuild an empire through truth, not terror. The profits you steal must be defended with fear, Jeremy explained as they walked past a soup kitchen. But the profits you earn become your protection, because the people you lift will defend you. Gary struggled fiercely. His old instincts, ruthless, immediate, and violent, warred constantly with the new ideals. When a minor rival tried to capitalize on Leo Marcano's absence, Gary's first thought was to send a crew. Poison, Jeremy murmured, reading the violence in Gary's eyes. That's the poison talking. Use the truth. Use the law. Your power is greater than a threat, Gary. Prove it. Gary felt like a man learning to walk again. His business decisions began to show the subtle spread of Jeremy's influence. He started asking questions no one expected. Who benefits? Is this win-win? Who did we hurt to get here? The changes weren't just theoretical. They became visible shifts in the Cloud Empire. A construction project that had ordered mass layoffs suddenly reversed the decision, citing a restructuring of labor priorities. Small-time debts Gary would have crushed men over were quietly forgiven. And astonishingly, the Cloud Foundation, previously a money-laundering front, began genuinely funding rehab centers and shelters that Jeremy knew personally. If you were Gary's lieutenant, seeing him funding shelters instead of ordering hits, what would you think? Would you see it as weakness or wisdom? Share your opinion in the comments. If you're rooting for Gary's difficult change, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the climax. The changes didn't go unnoticed. In the shadowed corners of bars and in the back seats of black cars, the whispers started. Did you hear? The boss gave back the land he took from the union last year. He shut down the docks operation. Too messy, they say. The consensus was soft, dangerous, and unsettling. The boss has changed. Gary knew they were watching, waiting for him to fail, waiting for the return of the old darkness. But as he looked at his gold ring, the symbol of his former rule, now resting on his nightstand, he knew he couldn't go back. He had swapped $1 billion of paranoia for one man's difficult, life-altering lesson, and he needed Jeremy Haine more than ever. Months became a new lifetime. The whispers that the boss has changed hardened into fact, and the cloud empire, built on fear, began a painful, dramatic metamorphosis. The transformation wasn't quick or easy. Every move Gary made felt like severing a limb. Guided by Jeremy's unseen hand, the old Mafia structure began to crumble. Gary dismantled smuggling networks piece by piece, closing down decades of profitable routes. The illicit flow of cash was redirected, reinvested into real industries, legitimate construction, housing developments, and tech startups. Gary was losing his name, the terrifying reputation that had been his greatest asset. Jeremy Haine, who still refused to enter any building with an address, warned him during a cold dawn meeting beneath a railroad overpass. Redemption costs everything, Gary, even your name. You trade the fear you commanded for the integrity you're earning. The old ghosts won't let go easily. And the old ghosts didn't. Gary's former rivals retaliated. Seeing the Cloud Empire vulnerable, they saw a chance to carve up his territory. Chaos erupted in the streets. Trucks were bombed. Construction sites were vandalized, and the price of protecting Gary's legitimate assets skyrocketed. Yet, a strange thing happened. While the chaos swelled, the police seemed to be looking the other way when it came to Gary's new, legitimate enterprises. Raids mysteriously avoided his legal warehouses and offices. Gary suspected this was Jeremy's contact network at work, the quiet, invisible power of a man who once ran the game and understood how to use the right kind of favor. If Jeremy is using his old connections to shield Gary, does that make the new empire truly clean? Is it possible to achieve redemption without compromising in a dirty world? Let me know what you think below. If you're on the edge of your seat, hit like and subscribe to see if Gary survives the final attack. The final act of the old world came on a brutal Tuesday. Gary's primary legal headquarters was hit in a coordinated attack intended to cripple his finances and send a lethal message. But right before the chaos, Jeremy disappeared. Gary arrived at their usual meeting spot, the deserted roof of a half-finished building, to find only a single, smooth river stone left on the ledge. The mentor was gone. Alone, surrounded by the smoke and fury of a war he was no longer equipped to fight with bullets, Gary stood firm. He wasn't thinking about his $10 billion. He was thinking about the debt he'd repaid, the lives he'd saved, and the principle he'd found. He repeated Jeremy's mantra, a cold steel against his soul. What survives when the banks burn is what you truly own. Gary survived the week. His enemies inflicted damage, but they failed to break him. When the dust settled, the Cloud Empire was fractured and significantly smaller. Gary's fearsome name was tarnished, forever linked to the street war. But his soul was freer than it had been in decades. He had lost the crown of the crime world, but he had found something worth more than all the gold. The lesson was complete. The dust settled not with the roar of victory, but with the quiet clarity of reform. The city watched, astonished, as the empire of Gary Cloud changed its nature. Weeks later, the city's newspapers were dominated by the transformation. The headlines were a mix of shock and cautious praise, chronicling the unprecedented events. Cloud Empire restructures. Illegal trades shut down. Mystery advisor spurs Mafia kings reform. Billionaire funding shelters as charities rise. Gary, looking thinner but possessing a steely new resolve, finally addressed the press. He stood not in front of the Royal Tower, but at the opening ceremony for a massive new housing shelter built on land he'd previously seized for a casino. The reporters were frenzied, desperate for the name of the shadowy advisor who had engineered the dismantling of one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. Gary met their questions with a calm smile. "The man who helped me will never take credit, and he will never take money," he stated simply. "He showed me that fear is a terrible foundation. He was a man who once lost everything, and he showed me how to earn what money can't buy." He gave no name, no details, only the ghost of a lesson. Do you think the public believes Gary's change is genuine, or do they still think he's running a massive scam? What kind of news headline would you write about this change? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. If you've followed Gary's story, show your appreciation by hitting like and subscribing to the channel. That night, Gary went to the river docks alone. He walked beneath the rusting steel trestle of the bridge, the smell of the river strong in the air. The space where Jeremy had built his small, temporary home was empty now. The fire barrel was overturned, the dirt swept clean. Jeremy Haine, the man who knew everything about Gary's past and who had gifted him a future, was gone. The only thing he left behind was a small, familiar rectangle of weathered cardboard resting against a concrete pier. Gary picked it up. The amateur scrawl, faded but still legible, was the final, perfect irony. "Need change? I can give you advice, too." Gary's smile this time wasn't mocking or strained. It was faint, real, and tinged with gratitude. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold signet ring, the one he'd removed when he asked Jeremy to teach him. The weight of his old life, the mark of his ruthless power. He gently placed the ring inside the overturned barrel. He didn't look back. He simply turned and walked away from the river, leaving the shadows behind and walking toward the faint glow of the coming dawn. He had finally learned that true wealth begins where greed ends.